Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into a topic that's wild, weird, and definitely not something you learned in school. Getting high in the ancient and medieval world. No, this isn't about modern-day parties or herbal trends. We're talking about mind-altering rituals, sacred intoxication, hallucinogenic honey, royal drug dens, and the kinds of trippy experiences that shaped empires, built mythologies, and even redefined power. Because here's the deal. Across the centuries, long before pharmacies or prohibition, people were already exploring altered states of consciousness. And they weren't doing it just for fun. Though, let's be real, some of them definitely were. They were chasing visions, speaking to gods, healing the sick, commanding armies, and sometimes just trying to escape the crushing reality of their lives. So buckle up, because this story takes us everywhere. From Egyptian temples thick with blue lotus smoke, to Viking mead halls echoing with psychedelic chants, to medieval monasteries where monks brewed beer strong enough to knock a horse sideways. We'll meet Persian emperors dabbling in hashish, Incan priests chewing coca leaves in mountaintop ceremonies, and Chinese alchemists hunting for the elixir of immortality that might have been a little too high proof. Let's begin our journey where civilization itself began, along the Nile. Picture this. The year is somewhere around 1500 BCE, and you're an Egyptian priest walking into the inner chamber of a temple. Incense curls in the air, the walls are covered in gold-tipped hieroglyphs, and at the center of it all is a shallow bowl of water filled with blue lotus flowers. You crush the petals into a drink, and as the sun pours through narrow slits in the stone, you feel it, the shift. A light buzzing in your limbs, the world softening at the edges. You're high. Blue lotus wasn't just pretty, it was mildly psychoactive. Ancient Egyptians believed it could connect the user with the divine, help them hear the voices of gods, see beyond death, maybe even float along the Nile in dreams. It became such a spiritual symbol that they painted it in tombs, buried it with pharaohs, and used it in funerary rites. But don't think it was just for priests. Party scenes on ancient scrolls show guests guzzling wine laced with blue lotus, dancing, flirting. And if the art is to be believed, getting very cozy under the stars. And Egypt wasn't alone. In ancient India, sages known as sadhus wandered the subcontinent, wrapped in ashes, dreads coiled atop their heads like crowns of wisdom. Their sacrament, bang, a potent cannabis drink made with crushed leaves, milk, spices, and sometimes a touch of honey. Consumed during religious festivals, bang wasn't just about euphoria. It was about dissolving the ego, becoming one with Shiva, the god of destruction and transcendence. Pilgrims drank it to cleanse the soul. Warriors drank it before battle to feel invincible. Meanwhile, in Persia, nobles and scholars used a different tool to touch the divine. Hashish. Made from cannabis resin, hashish became a favorite among mystics and poets, especially those in Sufi orders. They believed it opened a gateway to God, a way to feel the ecstatic truth behind the veil of reality. Hashish eaters, as they were called, drifted through gardens whispering prayers, composing poetry, or lying under stars that suddenly felt like they were listening. But intoxication wasn't always holy. Sometimes it was political. Let's jump forward to the Abbasid Caliphate, the golden age of Islamic science and culture. In the palaces of Baghdad, where scrolls were copied and translated and astronomers charted the sky, rulers and courtiers sipped opium-infused wine. Opium, derived from poppies, was traded across the Silk Road, prized for its pain-killing and pleasure-inducing effects. It dulled wounds, yes, but it also gave rise to dreamlike states where reality slipped sideways. It was dangerous, addictive, and powerful. You could silence pain, or cloud a mind, or both. The same was true in ancient China. There, Taoist alchemists chased the ultimate high, not just of the body, but of the soul. They believed in immortality elixirs, concoctions made of mercury, lead, arsenic, and other dangerously toxic substances. Yes, that's right, poison was the path to paradise. The thinking was, by purifying the body through extremes, you could ascend to higher realms. Some emperors even died chasing that dream, slowly poisoned by their own ambition for eternal life. But let's zoom in on one of the strangest and most delicious, mind-altering substances in the ancient world: mad honey. High in the Black Sea region, in what is now modern-day Turkey, there grows a particular type of rhododendron that produces neurotoxic nectar. The bees here make honey that doesn't just taste sweet, it alters your perception. Ancient Greek armies discovered this the hard way. Xenophon wrote about soldiers who ate the local honey and began vomiting, staggering, hallucinating, even losing consciousness. The Persians figured out how to weaponize it. They'd leave pots of mad honey along paths for invading forces. Enemies would indulge and collapse. It was warfare via honey jar. And that brings us to the ancient Greeks. Now these folks were no strangers to altered states. The Eleusinian Mysteries, a secret religious rite held in honor of Demeter and Persephone, involved a potion called the Kykeon. No one knows exactly what was in it, but many historians now believe it may have been brewed with ergot, a fungus similar to LSD. Participants fasted, drank the brew, and reported visions of the underworld, encounters with divine beings, and a feeling of eternal insight. Plato, Aristotle, and Sophocles all participated. They claimed it was the most profound experience of their lives. So the ancients weren't just getting high, they were building belief systems around it. But what about the medieval era? What about the so-called Dark Ages? Well, they were a lot weirder than we give them credit for. Let's set the scene. A small medieval village somewhere in Europe. The year is 1349. The Black Death is tearing through the countryside. Priests are overwhelmed, doctors are useless, and the world feels like it's ending. In the midst of this terror, people turn to plants. Mandrake, henbane, belladonna, aca deadly nightshade, these weren't just poisons. In the right doses, they were also powerful hallucinogens. Witches, healers, women accused of both, they knew the recipes. In old apothecary texts, we find descriptions of flying ointments, pastes made of fat and psychotropic herbs rubbed onto the skin, or even more intimate areas, let's say. The idea, it allowed the soul to fly, to commune with spirits. Some even believed it helped witches attend their sabbats naked and weightless, flying through the sky. Of course, The church said this was heresy, but behind closed doors. Some monks were brewing extremely strong beer, 10% alcohol or more, often laced with additional herbs for meditation. Cistercian monks were known to use wormwood, a key ingredient in absinthe. It's possible that some religious visions came less from divine intervention and more from medieval mixology. Meanwhile, over in the Islamic world, physicians were cataloging plants with remarkable properties. In texts like Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, hashish is listed as both a remedy and a potential hazard. The balance was delicate. Too much and the mind unraveled. Just enough, and the pain of the world melted away. Even in pre-Columbian America, rituals of intoxication were common. In the Andes, Incan priests chewed coca leaves, the raw source of cocaine, to withstand harsh mountain air and enter trances during sacrifice. In Mesoamerica, the Maya and Aztecs used peyote, mushrooms, and tobacco so strong it bordered on psychedelic. These weren't party drugs. These were tools to talk to the gods. And then came the consequences. As empires rose and fell, as religion hardened and colonialism spread, many of these ancient practices were demonized or destroyed. Getting high went from sacred to sinful. The church called it witchcraft. Colonial governments called it savagery. But the roots ran too deep. Even today, we still feel the echo of those ancient highs in our medicines, in our ceremonies, in our dreams. Because here's the twist. To understand how ancient people altered their minds is to understand how they shaped their worlds. The visions, the courage, the madness, it all fed into the stories they left behind. From the pyramids to the Parthenon to the battlefield chants of Viking berserkers, this wasn't just history. It was an altered state of civilization itself. And that's just part one. If you thought Blue Lotus tea was wild, wait until you hear what medieval nuns were hiding in their herb gardens, or what Roman emperors were sipping behind closed curtains. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't, and buckle up, because part 2 is coming soon, and trust me, we're just getting started. Now let's go back to the world of incense-filled chambers, ritual fires, and sacred smoke, not just for worship, but for waking up the senses. Because while medieval Europe was often painted in cold stone and candlelight, beyond the castles and cathedrals, there was another world, lush, fragrant, and deeply intoxicated. Have you ever smelled burning frankincense in a church and felt, for a moment, like time slowed down? That wasn't an accident. The olfactory power of resins like frankincense and myrrh wasn't just ceremonial, it was psychological. Monks used it to lift the soul, yes, but also to quite literally dull the senses, soften the mood, and bend the body toward contemplation. Inhaling that perfumed smoke for hours could alter brain waves. It still does. But while incense was considered divine, wine was its more earthly twin. In medieval monasteries, wine wasn't just sipped, it was prescribed. For sleep, for digestion, for melancholy, and sometimes for visions. Think of Hildegard von Bingen, mystic, composer, and herbalist. Her divine revelations were legendary. But behind the curtain, a diet of herbs, fasting, intense chanting, and often medicinal wine infused with mugwort, valerian, or even henbane, plants known for their psychoactive or sedative properties. These weren't accidents. They were recipes, and the recipes got bolder the further east you went. In Islamic medicine during the Golden Age, stretching from Baghdad to Andalusia, physicians like Avicenna were cataloging the mind-bending effects of hashish, opium, and henbane with chilling precision. This was science mixed with spirit. Hashish was known not just for recreation, but for its potential to open the door to dreams. Mystics didn't just pray, they floated. Hashish dens existed quietly under the shadow of minarets. Travelers in the 11th century described gardens filled with men reclined in dreamlike states, whispering to invisible jinn. And yet, not everyone approved. As early as the 13th century, hashish was banned by Islamic authorities who feared its power to seduce the soul away from God and duty. Sound familiar? But hashish wasn't the only intoxicant being questioned. In China, a very different plant reigned, mahuang or ephedra. Used for centuries in Taoist alchemy, this stimulant was believed to help seekers access prolonged energy, even immortality. Alchemists mixed it with minerals, metals, and sometimes mercury. The goal? Transcendence. The cost? Often death. But let's come back to Europe for a moment, where things were growing darker and stranger. Because while noblewomen powdered their faces with lead and monks prepared wine infused with calming herbs, on the outskirts of society, deep in the forest, down winding trails, across misty hills, something else was brewing. Witches. Or rather, herbalists. The so-called witches of medieval Europe weren't casting spells with wands. They were experimenting with psychoactive plants, belladonna, mandrake, datura, and they weren't drinking them. That would kill you. They were applying them to their skin, through oils, through ointments, often with the help of a broomstick. Yes, the infamous flying witch wasn't riding the broom. She was using it as a tool for transdermal absorption. And the flying part, that wasn't metaphor. Under the influence of these compounds, scopolamine, atropine, users would experience intense hallucinations. Dreams of flying, of dancing with demons, of slipping into another realm entirely. To outsiders, it looked like madness, but to the women in their cottages, it was medicine, escape, sometimes a spiritual journey. And then, of course, there was the church, watching, waiting, condemning. But the line between blessed and banned was never so clear. Take hyoscyamus, known as henbane, the same plant that could send your thoughts spiraling into visions, was also prescribed by physicians in cloisters and apothecaries. The difference? Who you were, a noblewoman in a palace inhaling smoke to calm her nerves, was called refined. A peasant woman mixing the same herbs in her hut, witch. Context was everything. And then there were the festivals. Oh yes. For all its austerity, medieval Europe had its wild side. Ever heard of the Feast of Fools? What began as a clerical celebration turned into drunken chaos. Masked monks danced on altars. Sacred songs were turned into bawdy ballads. And behind the masks, people drank spiced wine, sometimes laced with poppy or wild hemp. In those moments, dizzy, euphoric, howling with laughter, did the lines between sacred and profane blur. Absolutely. But while Europe was secretly sipping from the bottle of altered consciousness, across the ocean, the Americas were dancing in daylight with full-blown psychedelia. The Aztecs had their Tiananacatl, literally flesh of the gods. These weren't just mushrooms, they were portals, consumed by priests, warriors, and kings in rituals that blended poetry, fire, and trance. These fungi were treated as living beings. You didn't take them, you communed with them. And the visions, they weren't entertainment, they were law, messages from the divine. A warrior could see his death. A ruler could witness the will of the gods. The wrong vision could end a reign. The right one could start a war. And in the Andes, the people drank chicha, a fermented corn beer, but they also chewed coca leaves long before they were turned into white powder. These leaves weren't recreational. They were spiritual. Offerings were made to the mountains, to the dead. They allowed laborers to work at altitude, yes, but also to dream at the edge of breath. Back in Africa, tribes in West and Central regions used the iboga root, a plant that still today is used in initiation rituals. The journey. Harrowing. Users would fast, then consume the bark. What followed were hours of visions, some euphoric, some terrifying. The goal wasn't pleasure, it was transformation, which brings us back to the idea we started with. In medieval times, getting high wasn't just about escape. It was about reaching something beyond yourself. A truth, a God, a vision. A sense of peace in a world that often felt brutal, uncertain, and short. Even in the heart of Europe's most devout monasteries, monks brewed liquors, chewed sacred herbs, inhaled smokes meant to quiet the mind and open the heart. In far-off temples, incense curled around golden statues while acolytes slipped into altered states to speak with the divine. Were they all just getting high? Or were they trying to answer a question that still haunts us today? So now, let's turn the page from ritual and religion to resistance. Because sometimes getting high wasn't about connecting with heaven, it was about surviving hell. Let me paint a picture for you. You're a peasant in 14th century France. The plague has swept through your village. You've lost family. The church bells ring endlessly. You don't read Latin. You barely eat. And someone, maybe a traveling friar, maybe your neighbor, hands you a root mandrake. You chew. Time bends. Your pain dulls. And for a moment, just a breath of a moment, the world makes sense. That right there was medicine. Not the polished, lab coat kind, but the raw, muddy, survivalist kind. Herbalism in medieval Europe was passed down in whispers. Mothers to daughters, wives to midwives. And though the clergy tried to control it, they couldn't contain it. Because the body will always reach for relief, and so will the mind. Let's talk about ergot. If you've never heard of it, ergot is a fungus that grows on rye. And when consumed, accidentally or intentionally, it can cause hallucinations, muscle spasms, convulsions. Think of it as medieval LSD, but way less predictable. There are tales, some of them terrifying, of entire villages writhing in madness after unknowingly baking bread with ergot-infected grain. Screaming, dancing, convulsing. Some believed they were possessed. Some believed they were saints. Others never recovered. But here's where it gets strange. Some scholars believe that ergot poisoning may have played a role in historical phenomena we still debate, like the dancing plague of 1518, or even the Salem witch trials, where hallucinations and fits were misread as sorcery. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? Was that witch really a witch, or was she just high on bad bread? Of course, not all altered states came from the pantry. Some came from devotion so intense it became physical. Enter the flagellants. In the wake of the Black Death, when Europe was cracking under the weight of death and dread, groups of men and women took to the streets, whipping themselves in ecstatic marches. The goal was penance, but the result, a frenzy. Blood, chanting, music. Trance-like states that bordered on the psychedelic, no herbs required. Just pain, rhythm, and the overwhelming need to be free of guilt. This was their high. This was their escape. And while the church eventually condemned them, the movement revealed something raw. When people are desperate, they don't need much to drift into altered states. Sometimes, they just need a rhythm, a ritual, a reason. But let's shift gears for a moment. Because while all this was happening in the West, halfway around the world, a very different kind of high was being explored. One that combined art, sound, and smoke. Welcome to medieval China. Here in the Tang and Song dynasties, poetry was currency, tea was meditation, and incense was a bridge between worlds. Taoist sages wrote of internal elixirs, practices involving breath, fasting, visualization, and yes, sometimes psychoactive herbs, to unlock cosmic energy and spiritual immortality. One famous herb, cannabis. That's right. Cannabis had been used in Chinese medicine for centuries, mainly as a painkiller and anesthetic. But certain Taoist alchemists believed it also opened the door of ghosts, a poetic way of describing the threshold between the seen and unseen. Paired with breathing rituals and isolation, it became a tool not for escapism, but for transformation. And across the mountains in India, the journey continued. You've probably heard of bhang, a drink made from cannabis, milk, spices, and sometimes opium. But bhang wasn't a party beverage. It was sacred. Consumed during festivals like Holi, bhang was linked to Lord Shiva, the destroyer and transformer. His devotees believed that intoxication with bhang brought them closer to the divine, helping dissolve ego and fear. Priests, pilgrims, commoners, they all drank together. The high wasn't sinful, it was holy. Which brings us to a deeper question. What happens when the sacred and the sinful get confused? Because in Europe, the same plant that cured pain in the monastery could condemn a woman in the marketplace. The same herb that calmed a monk was burned with a witch. And yet, in every culture, people kept reaching. Even under the strictest laws, even in the darkest times, we kept reaching. Think about the enslaved people brought to the Americas, ripped from their lands, their languages, their herbs, their rituals. But even in chains, they found ways to preserve their medicine. They grew plants in hidden gardens. They whispered recipes across fields. They passed on the knowledge of which roots could heal, which could dull pain, and which could help the spirit fly, if only for a little while. Some used snuff made from tobacco and other herbs to invoke trance. Others danced in circle rhythms so intense they altered consciousness without a drop of drug. Getting high in these cases wasn't about luxury. It was rebellion. It was survival. It was a way to remember who you were when the world tried to make you forget. Now let's flip the script again. Picture a nobleman in Florence. He's drinking a cordial of alcohol, clove, and opium, what we might call a proto-liquor. He's wearing silk, he's listening to lute music, and he's writing poetry about God and death. That's a high too, but one with gold trim. Meanwhile, on the streets, a beggar is chewing henbane leaves to fight off cold and madness. No silk, no poetry, but just as much need for escape. Same impulse, different story. And in both stories, you'll find the seeds of what we still wrestle with today. Who gets to explore consciousness? Who gets punished for it? And what's the difference between a sacrament and a crime? Because here's the truth. Getting high, however you define it, has always been a part of the human story. It's been sacred, scandalous, healing, dangerous, criminal, divine. It's never been just one thing, it's always been a mirror. And what it reflects is us. Our fears, our hopes, our longing to feel more, or sometimes to feel less. And that longing, it's never gone away. Let's go further now, not just across borders, but across thresholds. The line between body and spirit, pain and ecstasy, devotion and delirium, it's always been blurrier than we admit. And nowhere is that blur more haunting than in the monasteries of medieval Europe. Imagine a monk cloistered behind stone walls. He spends his days copying scripture, fasting, praying for the souls of sinners. His body aches. His spirit strains. And to silence temptation to stay awake through midnight vigils, he reaches, not for wine, not for food, but for a tonic brewed from valerian root, poppy resin, or wild lettuce. This wasn't indulgence. This was discipline. You see, many monastic orders, particularly the Benedictines and the Cistercians, developed pharmacopoeias that rivaled modern medicine cabinets. Manuscripts like the Physica by Hildegard of Bingen catalogued dozens of herbs for calming the mind and loosening the body. Chamomile, hyssop, wormwood, each plant had a soul, and that soul could speak to the suffering. Some concoctions induced visions, some numbed pain, others were crafted to allow divine dreams, a state between sleep and wakefulness where the voice of God might be heard. And yet step outside those cloisters and the same herb might get you killed. Because in towns and villages, the church began to fear what it could not control. Women who knew how to heal, dangerous. Forest dwellers with teas for childbirth pain, suspect. A midwife with a balm that quieted grief or eased labor with mandrake root. She wasn't a healer anymore. She was a witch. Let us be clear. The so-called witches of medieval Europe weren't tossing fireballs in the woods. They were often wise women, herbalists, folk doctors, survivors of oral tradition. And many of them used substances we now know had psychoactive effects. Belladonna, datura, henbane, plants that when brewed properly could induce trances, numb agony, or stimulate visions. But when misunderstood or purposely vilified, these same women became scapegoats. The stakes were life and death. But even fear couldn't stop the human urge to alter experience. Now, shift continents with me again. Let's head south to the Saharan trade routes of Africa. Here, in the markets of Timbuktu and the healing houses of Morocco, hashish was not only used, it was respected. Traders brought cannabis resin from the east, and Sufi mystics adopted it in their spiritual practices. Under the rhythmic hum of prayer, in the swirls of incense, some Sufi orders would ingest small amounts of hashish to quiet the ego and enter ecstatic devotion. This wasn't recreation. This was annihilation of the self, an attempt to dissolve the ego so fully that only God remained. And isn't that what so many highs try to do? Not distract us from the world, but pull us beyond it. Back in India, the Ayurvedic tradition had already been exploring this idea for centuries. Take soma, for example. No one knows exactly what soma was. It's a mystery lost to time. Some think it was a mushroom. Others believe it was a blend of herbs. But in Vedic texts, it's described as a divine drink, a nectar consumed by priests and offered to the gods. To drink soma was to see truth, to merge with cosmic rhythm. And again, like Bang, it wasn't for escape. It was for union. But let's step away from temples now. Let's look at something far more common. Because while kings and clerics were debating divinity, farmers were doing something more practical. Getting high to survive pain. Whether it was the sting of cold, the grind of plow work, or the hollow ache of hunger, medieval peasants found relief where they could. One powerful source, alcohol, but not the wine of the nobility. I'm talking about rough, bitter brews, meads spiked with wild herbs, ciders fermented to surprising strength. Ale was safer than water in many towns, and so people drank heavily daily. But when that wasn't enough, they turned to herbal highs. Take wild lettuce, known as poor man's opium. Found growing along hedgerows, this plant's milky sap could be brewed into a tea to dull pain and induce drowsiness. Or skullcap, a humble flower that could reduce anxiety and soothe tremors. They didn't call it self-care, but that's exactly what it was. Meanwhile, across the Islamic world, from Persia to Andalusia, a golden age of pharmacology was unfolding. In the libraries of Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, scholars like Avicenna and Al-Razi were cataloging hundreds of medicinal plants. Some of those, psychoactive. They didn't use the word high, of course, but they spoke of humors, of balancing the body and mind. A disturbed soul might be calmed with opium, a melancholic heart lifted with saffron or myrrh. And yes, opium. By the 10th century, opium had become a staple in Islamic medicine, used in balms, tinctures, and inhaled through reeds. Physicians saw it as a gift, but also a risk. They debated its dosage. They feared its hold. Because even back then, people knew the line between medicine and addiction is razor thin. Which brings us to a different kind of high, not chemical, but sonic. Let's talk about music. Across cultures, music has always had the power to alter consciousness. The drumming of Yoruba ceremonies, the chanting of Gregorian monks, the drone of a sitar echoing through a stone temple. These weren't performances. They were vehicles carrying people into trance, catharsis, tears. In medieval Scotland, there were tales of second sight, visions triggered by music, weather, or dreams. Bards and seers drank heather ale and chanted into firelight, seeking glimpses of things yet to come. In Siberia, shamans beat drums faster and faster, then inhaled smoke from burning herbs, birch, juniper, or hallucinogenic mushrooms, to cross into the spirit world. Even the Vikings used sound and substance. Skalds, their poet warriors, would drink fermented honey, chant sagas, and summon the fury of gods before battle. So ask yourself, is that high or holy? And is there even a difference? Because sometimes the most powerful altered states require no substance at all. Only rhythm, breath, darkness, and surrender. Now close your eyes for a second and imagine you're not a peasant or a monk. You're a queen or a concubine. Or maybe a court alchemist, slipping through velvet corridors with a vial of something forbidden. Because in medieval courts, from Baghdad to Byzantium, from the Forbidden City to France, the appetite for altered states didn't just survive. It thrived, not in the form of dirty ale or humble herbs, but in the carefully prepared elixirs, powders, and perfumes whispered about in royal chambers. In the Ottoman Empire, palace physicians weren't just healing wounds. They were concocting blends of opium, myrrh, saffron, and rosewater. Some of it for sleep, some of it for pleasure, some just enough to open a door in the mind and let something divine or dangerous walk in. The harem wasn't just silk and seduction. It was also sedation. And in China's Song and Tang courts, where scholars, poets, and courtesans mingled, the drink of choice wasn't always tea. It was alcohol infused with medicinal mushrooms, powders laced with ginseng, and in some cases, resins from hemp or poppy. Poems from the period speak of riding clouds, seeing ghosts, or floating above peach blossoms. All metaphor maybe, or maybe not. Because while Confucian values preached restraint, the reality inside imperial walls was often indulgence wrapped in ritual. Meanwhile in Europe, a different drama was unfolding. You've heard of the Black Death. You've heard of the flagellants, those who whipped themselves through city streets, begging for God's mercy. But did you know that during plague years, the church authorized certain substances to ease the agony of the dying? Monks prepared tinctures of opium and alcohol. Physicians burned laudanum, a bitter liquid made from poppy and wine. And traveling plague doctors, yes, the ones in those eerie bird masks, sometimes carried psychotropic herbs in the beaks to protect themselves, not just from disease, but from madness. Rosemary, mint, wormwood, sometimes soaked in vinegar, sometimes laced with camphor or even powdered mandrake, because the smells of death were unbearable, and the fear even worse. But what happens when the fear fades? What happens when the horror passes, but the drug remains? We have evidence from Spain from the 14th century of noblemen becoming addicted to opium wine after being treated for gallstones. There are Arabic manuscripts that warn of sleep powders that rob a man of his spirit. In China, records show emperors growing paranoid, aloof, and erratic after years of heavenly tonics. And yet, it wasn't just nobles who fell into this trap. In the gutters and taverns of London, in the spice bazaars of Cairo, and even in the quiet shrines of Kyoto, something else was taking hold: addiction. The word itself didn't exist yet, but the behavior did. People returning again and again to the same tea, the same pipe, the same medicine, chasing that first moment of calm or bliss, or forgetting. And society, as always, couldn't decide what to do about it. Sometimes the users were saints, sometimes criminals, sometimes visionaries, sometimes madmen, but always human. Let's jump to West Africa for a moment. In Yoruba culture, herbal knowledge was passed down through generations of women. These weren't secret recipes written in books. They were songs, prayers, touch. When someone suffered from spiritual torment, a ghost, a dream, a curse, healers might prepare a drink called agbo, a mix of roots, bark, and sacred herbs. Some of these ingredients had psychoactive properties. Others induced sleep. But the real key, the ceremony itself, drumming, chanting, steam baths, dancing, it wasn't just about getting high. It was about coming back into balance. Compare that to Europe, where most substances that altered consciousness were either taxed, restricted, or demonized. The difference wasn't the drugs, it was the framework. When taken inside a ritual, it was holy. Outside that context, it was heresy, madness, or crime. Which brings us to one of the most fascinating groups of the medieval world, the alchemists. You've probably heard of them as proto-scientists trying to turn lead into gold. But that was just the surface. Many alchemists were obsessed with something deeper, achieving perfect clarity, divine knowledge, even immortality. And how did they do it? Through long fasts, through meditation, through experiments with mercury, sulfur, and yes, psychoactive herbs. Some alchemical texts describe a red tincture that could cause visions. Others talk of volatile spirits that bring prophecy. The famed Book of Secrets by Albertus Magnus describes dream elixirs using poppy and wine. The Arabic Kitab al-Ishtarak warns of elixirs that expand the soul but cost the body. Alchemy wasn't about getting rich. It was about touching the untouchable. And sometimes it burned the hands that reached. Now shift your gaze again to the forest, to the gathering dusk, to a young woman, maybe a healer, maybe a dreamer, collecting nightshade under a crescent moon. She carries a satchel of herbs, some for menstrual pain, some for childbirth, some for crossing boundaries. In rural Europe, flying ointments weren't myth. They were recipes passed down in secret. Made of belladonna, henbane, datura, and mixed with animal fat, these balms could be applied to the skin or the most absorbent parts of the body and produce intense hallucinations. Accounts describe feelings of flying, of dancing with demons, of visiting distant lands. Church authorities called it devil worship, but modern science, it calls it tropine alkaloid intoxication. So which is it? Witchcraft or chemistry? And why were women so often the ones punished for it? Because they were close to the body, close to the earth, close to knowledge that couldn't be tamed. And in a world obsessed with order, that made them dangerous. Hey guys, if you've ever wondered what it's like to get high in the middle of a battlefield, this part is for you. Forget incense. Forget tea. We're talking about warriors, men and women who didn't just use substances to escape pain, but to become pain itself. They swallowed, smoked, or smeared whatever would make them faster, stronger, wilder. They weren't trying to feel good. They were trying to feel nothing. Let's start in the icy north. You've probably heard of the Viking berserkers, those shirtless, axe-swinging maniacs who stormed into battle foaming at the mouth, impervious to pain. But here's what you might not know. Many historians believe their rage wasn't just spiritual, it was chemical. There's a theory that berserkers consumed Amanita muscaria, the bright red mushroom with white spots. Yes, the same one from fairy tales. In small doses, it causes euphoria, twitching muscles, and an overwhelming sense of strength. In higher doses, nausea, hallucinations, and full-on battle frenzy. Imagine it. The air cold, your breath steaming, and you've just chewed a handful of mushrooms that make your heart feel like a war drum. You're not afraid. You're not even human anymore. You're something else. And in the chaos of medieval war, that something was a terrifying advantage. But the berserkers weren't alone. Across the sea in Africa, warriors among the Zulu, Ashanti, and Maasai were known to use a mix of khat, bitter cola, and even cannabis, especially before raids or duels. These weren't recreational highs. They were strategic, dulling pain, increasing stamina, blunting fear. Some tribes chewed iboga, a root with powerful psychoactive properties, during long initiation rites or before battle. It caused vivid visions and a trance-like state that could last for days. Elders guided warriors through the high, shaping their hallucinations into purpose, into mission, into fire. Over in Japan, the samurai had a different approach. Their code, Bushido, emphasized discipline and self-mastery. But some accounts from the Sengoku period, the Warring States era, hint at secret mixtures taken before battle. Sake laced with herbs like ginseng, mandrake, or asafoetida, meant to calm the nerves and awaken the warrior spirit. And let's not forget the ninja, who reportedly used powders that heightened alertness or dulled pain after an injury. Some even carried smoke balls laced with narcotic herbs, thrown to confuse enemies, but also to shield escape under a haze of altered vision. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, certain Sufi warriors trained themselves to enter states of ecstatic trance through rhythm, breath, and in rare cases, hashish. These were not addicts. They were mystics with swords. And to them, a high wasn't intoxication. It was union with the divine. Which brings us to one of the strangest and most controversial chapters in this story, the Hashishin. You've heard the word assassin, right? Well, it comes from this group, an Islamic sect active during the Crusades, who used targeted killings and psychological warfare to reshape the politics of the Middle East. According to both Crusader chronicles and Islamic historians, these killers used hashish in their training rituals. Now, the truth is debated. Some say they consumed the drug to induce visions of paradise, making them fearless of death. Others say the stories were propaganda, meant to make them seem inhuman. But think about it. What's more terrifying than a man who doesn't care if he dies? Maybe a man who believes dying brings him joy. Whether it was hashish or trance or just fanatic belief, the result was the same. And then there's the Christian world. At first glance, you'd think medieval Christianity had nothing to do with getting high. Wrong. Some flagellants during periods of intense religious revival worked themselves into ecstatic frenzies, not just with whips, but with fasting, chanting, and even inhaling aromatic oils or fermented vapors. There's evidence from 14th century Italy of monks using strong resins, like frankincense and myrrh, burned in tight chapels. until everyone inside collapsed in visions of Christ or judgment. Were they possessed? Or just stoned for God? Some mystics, like Hildegard of Bingen, described visions filled with fire, light, and celestial music. Historians still debate whether she suffered migraines, epilepsy, or if she used herbal compounds for spiritual experience. Then there were the Crusaders. Out on campaign for months, even years, they used whatever was available. Fermented mare's milk in the Mongol camps, poppy mixtures from Arab apothecaries, even strong spirits they learned to distill from the East. Some of them came home with more than battle scars. They came home with cravings. One document from a knight of the Teutonic Order complains of fever of the mind, and thirst that no water quenches, signs of opium withdrawal. Maybe medieval war was just so brutal that even the high wasn't high enough anymore. And now let's jump to something more personal. You're a peasant, a soldier, a healer, maybe just someone who's seen too much. Your son is dead, your crops have failed. You walk into a marketplace and you see an old woman selling little brown bottles. She says it's from the East, says it'll help you sleep, or forget. You take it, and just like that, you're free. Or maybe you've just built a new prison. You ever wonder how people in the Middle Ages got high on more than just power or war? Well, welcome to the secret side of medieval pleasure. The aphrodisiacs, love potions, and elixirs of desire that blurred the line between medicine, magic, and manipulation. Because when it came to love, lust, and control, the medieval world had a cabinet full of intoxicating tricks. Let's get into it. Picture this. A candlelit chamber, velvet curtains drawn, the scent of rose water in the air. On the bed lies not a princess, but a widow, wealthy, bored, and freshly perfumed with musk and civet. She reaches for a small vial hidden beneath her pillow, a blend of saffron, cinnamon, myrrh, crushed mandrake root, and just a touch of Spanish fly. And just like that, the alchemy of seduction begins. But wait, Spanish fly. That wasn't a metaphor. It was real. Made from crushed blister beetles, Spanish fly was one of the most notorious aphrodisiacs of the medieval and Renaissance world. It caused a burning sensation and increased blood flow to the groin, which people mistook for arousal. Spoiler alert, it was actually toxic. Too much could cause internal bleeding, organ damage, or even death. But that didn't stop nobles, courtiers, or even monks from chasing that heat. Because pleasure, like power, made people reckless. And it wasn't just beetles. The Mughal courts of India brewed complex love elixirs using rose petals, sandalwood, cardamom, and sometimes opium. These weren't just romantic, they were ritualized, given before royal marriages, slipped into drinks before secret trysts. In the harem, perfumes were as important as politics. In China, the Taoist text spoke of yang-boosting tonics, mixtures made from deer antler, ginseng, and wine aged with dried geckos. Some even believed that sleeping with multiple virgins could restore vitality, an idea that led to disturbing practices cloaked in alchemical mysticism. Meanwhile, in Europe, the church cracked down on witches for brewing love potions. But the truth, everyone was doing it. Old recipes called for wine steeped with basil, clove, or even menstrual blood. Yes, you read that right. Some women kept bundles of herbs hidden in their bodices, or wore scented amulets laced with psychoactive oils. One German text even recommended rubbing mashed fennel and cannabis oil beneath the tongue and upon the nethers to inspire longing in a cold lover. And then there were the bathhouses. Forget the sanitized spas of today. In places like Paris, Constantinople, or Baghdad, bathhouses were part wellness center, part social hub, part carnal theater. Men and women steamed in clouds of juniper and pine resin, rubbed each other with hashish-infused oils, and drank fermented date wine or spiced mead until their inhibitions dissolved like soap. Poets wrote about these places with reverence and eroticism. In the Islamic world, hashish became known as the bush of understanding, a plant that soothed the heart, stoked conversation, and depending on the poet, opened more than just the mind. But it wasn't all hedonism. Sometimes the line between healing and harm, desire and doom, blurred in terrifying ways. Let's talk about love potions that were really poisons. In medieval Italy, noblewomen learned from older housemaids how to brew drinks that made their husbands fall asleep deeply. Too deeply. Sometimes forever. A little belladonna in wine. A touch of henbane. A whisper of nightshade. Love and murder cooked in the same kitchen. There's a famous case from 17th century Rome known as the Aqua Tofana scandal. It involved a widow, Giulia Tofana, who sold her custom, cosmetic water to noblewomen. In reality, it was arsenic in disguise, marketed as a slow, undetectable way to escape abusive marriages. She called it a gift from the Virgin Mary. That's how desperate women were. They had to choose between being devout and being deadly. Even the church couldn't keep love and highness apart. Medieval monks wrote sermons against herbs of temptation, condemning the use of damiana, lovage, and valerian root. But archaeological digs at abbeys have uncovered jars labeled with the same herbs, sometimes stored alongside wine-soaked figs or elixirs for prayer. Were they hypocrites or just human? Let's not forget the sex workers, who knew more about potions than physicians. In the brothels of London and Florence, women crafted tonics from juniper, hops, and poppy syrup to calm aggressive clients, or heighten the illusion of passion. These weren't women of sin. They were pharmacists of survival. And through it all, the scent of sex and intoxication clung to the air of every kingdom, from the spiced breath of a Byzantine courtesan to the musky beard of a Viking chieftain drunk on mead and magic mushrooms. It wasn't always about love. Sometimes it was about power. Who held the cup? Who drank first? Who forgot? Who remembered? These little highs sipped, smoked, or smeared had the power to start affairs, end dynasties, or change the fate of empires. And in a world where women were often silenced, the love potion was their whisper, their rebellion, their revenge. Have you ever wondered what it's like to take a trip, not through space, but through spirit? Because in the ancient and medieval world, people didn't just get high to escape. They got high to connect with the divine, with the ancestors, with the raw truth of the universe itself. This wasn't about parties. It was about prophecy. Let's start with the mysterious Sibyls, female oracles in ancient Greece and Rome, who entered trance-like states to deliver messages from the gods. While some believed they were simply overcome by divine ecstasy, others whispered that they chewed laurel leaves, inhaled volcanic fumes, or even drank mixtures infused with psychoactive herbs. At Delphi, the most famous oracle sat over a chasm in the earth, breathing in vapors that emerged from the rocks. Was it sulfur, ethylene gas, something else entirely? We may never know. But people came from across the world to hear her riddled visions, kings, generals, and even emperors. Because one word from a high priestess could shape the fate of nations. And it wasn't just the Greeks. Zoroastrianism, the religion that helped shape the Persian Empire, had its own sacred intoxicant, halma, a ritual drink brewed from a now-lost plant. Halma was consumed by priests to gain clarity, stamina, and spiritual vision. In sacred hymns, it was praised as both a god and a medicine, a giver of strength and a destroyer of lies. Some scholars believe it was made from ephedra, others say it was psychedelic. Whatever it was, halma helped warriors fight longer, priests pray deeper, and kings feel closer to divinity. Move west, and you'll find early Christian mystics fasting for days, drinking small amounts of fermented mead, or inhaling incense heavy with myrrh and frankincense to prepare for visions. Saints claim to see angels in their ecstasies, and some even bled spontaneously. Stigmata, they called it. Were they miracles or altered states? In the East, Buddhist monks were known to use tea brewed with wild mushrooms or powdered roots to prolong meditation. In Tibet, some monks chewed on rhodiola, an adaptogenic herb that fought fatigue, sharpened the mind, and opened the door to visions of infinite compassion. Meanwhile, Hindu yogis smoked hashish from chillums in their mountaintop caves, not to get high in the modern sense, but to shed the ego, to see the truth without filters. They weren't chasing escape, they were chasing enlightenment. But here's where things get really wild. In Norse tradition, the legendary seeresses known as Volvas practiced a form of magic called satyr. Part shaman, part sorceress, part storyteller, they would chant, sway, and burn herbs to induce trances. Many of these ceremonies involved mind-altering smoke. Some say henbane, others say fly agaric mushrooms. These women could see into the past, the future, and even the realm of the dead. And their services were prized, even by Viking kings. In Africa, especially in the Sahel and Great Lakes regions, spiritual healers known as ngangas or diviners used powdered roots, smoke, and drumming to enter altered states. Under the influence of kola nut, cannabis, or stronger brews, they would speak with ancestors, diagnose disease, or guide communities through crises. They weren't feared, they were revered. In Mesoamerica, the Aztecs and Maya saw no line between medicine and mysticism. They used psychoactive mushrooms, morning glory seeds, and fermented honey drinks to commune with the gods. They called it Tiananakatl, flesh of the gods. Rituals were overseen by priests, dancers, and midwives, often during lunar cycles or eclipses. The goal was never fun. It was knowledge, healing, connection. Even today, some indigenous shamans in Mexico and South America continue these traditions, calling upon ayahuasca or peyote to journey inward and speak with the earth. But Europe, That's where things got complicated. Because while saints, monks, and mystics had their sanctioned highs, any woman with herbs and wisdom was labeled a witch. The same mugwort that helped a midwife ease childbirth. Now it was a flying ointment. The same belladonna that eased pain during fever. A demonic elixir. Witch trials didn't just burn people. They scorched centuries of folk medicine, often carried by women who knew too much, who healed too well, and who dared to reach beyond the church's grip. There's even documentation of women making flying ointments from henbane, belladonna, mandrake, and fat, anointing their skin and entering dreamlike states. Did they fly? Not literally, but they believed they did. And for a poor woman in medieval Europe, trapped in a life of suffering, that dream might have been the only escape she ever knew. These weren't just drugs. They were doorways. Doorways to gods, to ancestors, to freedom. So what's the point of all this? That getting high in the medieval world wasn't just about pleasure or escape. It was a deeply spiritual act, sometimes healing, sometimes terrifying, but always meaningful. These people didn't just light candles and say prayers. They ate the root, drank the brew, burned the leaf, walked into the unknown. And sometimes they came back with wisdom, sometimes with madness, and sometimes they never came back at all. Hey guys, so have you ever wondered what went on behind the stone walls of royal castles and candlelit monasteries? I mean, what did medieval elites do when they weren't at war or throwing banquets? Well, let's just say, some of them were on very strong medication. Let's start with the monastic apothecaries. Hidden in the silence of medieval abbeys, monks weren't just copying manuscripts or chanting prayers. They were also the chemists of their time, herbalists, healers, and whether they admitted it or not, early alchemists dabbling with altered states. Their shelves held powdered poppy for sleep, mandrake for visions, henbane for pain, monkshood also known as wolfsbane for God knows what. Some of these were used carefully, mixed into tinctures or brews. Others, they were downright dangerous. And yet, a surprising number of healing rituals were inseparable from altered consciousness. Take the soporific sponge, a cloth soaked in opium, mandrake, and hemlock. Surgeons would place it over a patient's face to knock them out before surgery. Essentially, early anesthesia. But the line between asleep and never waking up was dangerously thin. Meanwhile, monks also experimented with distillation, turning wine into spirits, then infusing it with herbs. The goal? Healing tonics. The result? Some of the earliest psychedelic elixirs in Western medicine. Now travel from the monastery to the palace. Because if the monks were brewing remedies, the royals were drinking them, not always wisely. In the court of Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France, perfume wasn't just fragrance, it was chemistry. Her personal perfumers crafted scents using ambergris, civet, musk, but also herbs like wormwood, clove, and valerian. Some of these had psychoactive properties when inhaled over time. One of her most controversial courtiers was Renée La Florentin, her Italian perfumer rumored to also be a poisoner. And in those days, the line between medicine and poison was razor thin. Belladonna to dilate pupils, sensual, fashionable, but toxic. Laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, was served in gilded vials. And don't forget wormwood-based elixirs, ancestors to absinthe, used in everything from digestion aids to mystical ceremonies. The royal court wasn't just perfumed, it was high-functioning and half-hallucinating. But perhaps the most elite and secretive users of altered states were the assassins of medieval Persia, particularly the Hashishin. Yes, that's where the word assassin comes from. These were not random killers. They were part of a militant sect operating out of mountain fortresses like Alamat, and they were trained to infiltrate and eliminate high-value targets, nobles, generals, even kings. Legend has it they were inducted into service using hashish-laced rituals, waking up in luxurious gardens filled with wine, silk, and song after a drugged trance, convinced they had visited paradise. The message was clear. Obey your leader and paradise awaits you again. Was it true? Historians debate it, but the legend was powerful. So powerful that even European crusaders feared the old man of the mountain and his fearless, drug-entranced followers. But while the West whispered of shadowy assassins, the East had its own version of spiritual intoxication. The Sufis, Sufi mystics, Islamic spiritual seekers, believed in divine ecstasy, and though they didn't rely on substances in the same way as others, their trances were often heightened by incense, repetition, and occasionally natural stimulants like coffee, tobacco, or betel nut. Their goal was fana, dissolution of the self. They would whirl for hours, spin to music, chant the names of God, and disappear into something bigger. And for them, that was the ultimate high, not a substance but a surrender. Still, let's not forget the dark side. Because for every monk healing with herbs, there was a courtier poisoning a rival. For every midwife helping a woman through pain, there was an inquisitor burning her at the stake for flying. And for every mystic seeking truth, there was a king, too addicted to sleep powders to rule with a clear head. In the 15th century, King Charles VI of France suffered episodes of madness. He believed he was made of glass. His doctors prescribed everything from cold baths to herbal sedatives, and possibly mercury. Yes, mercury. In fact, mercury was commonly used to treat syphilis later on, an illness that spread like wildfire among both royals and commoners. The cure was sometimes worse than the disease. And then there's Paracelsus, the rebellious physician of the Renaissance who claimed that poison is in everything, and no thing is without poison. The dose makes the poison. This man created concoctions that made alchemists blush. He fed patients powdered minerals, infused alcohol with opiates, and believed that spiritual and physical healing were one and the same. Was he a madman? Maybe. But he changed medicine forever. And here's the twist. While the common folk were being accused of witchcraft for boiling herbs, the elite had entire teams of alchemists, doctors, and apothecaries brewing up far stranger things. Sometimes for healing, sometimes for vision, sometimes for control. Hey guys, let me ask you something. What happens when healing becomes heresy? When a cup of tea from grandma could land you in chains? Welcome to the world of midwives, wise women, and folk healers. The underground chemists of the medieval and early modern world. These weren't just caretakers or herbalists. They were often the last hope for the sick, the grieving, the desperate. And what they offered was nothing short of transformation. We begin with the hedge witches. In villages across Europe, far from the Latin scribbling monks and perfumed court doctors, there were women who learned from the earth. Passed down from mother to daughter, their knowledge was oral, practical, and dangerously effective. They grew mugwort for visions, crushed juniper berries to purify the air, steeped valerian root to calm nerves, boiled angelica, horehound, and wild lettuce for fevers, coughs, and sleepless nights. Their tools were not scalpels or scrolls, but boiling pots, smoke bundles, and whispered prayers. Some of them used combinations so powerful, so strange, that they earned whispered names. Flying ointment witches brew the balm of the moon. Flying ointment. That's the stuff of legend. But it was very real. Often made with belladonna, henbane, mandrake, and datura, these ointments were said to give women the feeling of flight. Not literally soaring on broomsticks, of course, but visions, floating sensations, and dissociation so intense that the line between dream and waking disappeared. These weren't party drugs. These were tools of communion, pain relief, divination, and yes, sometimes escape. But to the church, they were blasphemy in a bottle. As the Inquisition spread, the line between healer and heretic was burned away, sometimes literally. Thousands of women across Europe were branded witches, tortured, and executed for their knowledge of herbs, roots, and rituals. Inquisitors wrote detailed confessions, many extracted under duress, describing sabbats, shape-shifting, and potions that made people dance with demons. But beneath all that, there were recipes, detailed, powerful, sometimes accurate recipes. One documented witch was said to use a salve of aconite, fat, and nightshade applied under the arms and between the thighs. The effects: deep sleep, vivid dreams, heightened sensations, a sense of flight, sound familiar. Modern researchers believe these concoctions functioned like transdermal hallucinogens, absorbed through mucous membranes and fat. In other words, medieval psychedelics administered through the skin. But the church couldn't see that. Or maybe it did and feared it. Why? Because a woman who could access altered states without clergy, without sacraments, without permission was a threat. And so the midwife became the witch, the healer became the heretic, and the garden, a crime scene. Meanwhile, on the other side of the globe, similar stories were unfolding, but with different endings. In West Africa, Yoruba priestesses brewed drinks of kola nut, shea bark, and fermented honey. Their ceremonies often involved music, dance, drumming, and drinks that altered consciousness to help them commune with spirits known as orishas. In the Americas, Mayan healers used cacao mixed with chili, honey, and hallucinogenic mushrooms for divination. Among the Aztec, priestesses known as Tlamatinem used morning glory seeds, rich in LSA, a cousin to LSD, for trance and communication with deities. And unlike in Europe, these women were often revered. Their visions were not condemned. They were sought after. Their drinks not burned but blessed. The real divide wasn't just East and West. It was power and fear. Because when a peasant woman gathered mushrooms to speak with her ancestors, she was a threat. But when a bishop drank fortified wine and claimed divine visions, he was a saint. Let's take a moment and talk about banquets of knowledge, ritual feasts where food and drink were laced with consciousness-altering herbs. In parts of medieval Scandinavia, seers called völvas would enter trance states by inhaling smoke and sipping fermented herbal mead. The Norse sagas describe them prophesying in riddles, their eyes glazed, their voices echoing like they were possessed. In Slavic lands, midwinter ceremonies included poppy seed bread, wormwood wine, and sacred chants. The goal: to cross the veil, to greet the dead, to survive the cold with more than just fire. Even Romani healers scattered across Europe carried traditions of smoke, herbs, and secret drinks passed from caravan to caravan. Some used burnt rosemary, others blue lotus, still others mandrake tea, bitter, intoxicating, and dangerous. But no matter where or how it happened, the same truth rang out. People wanted to reach beyond pain, beyond grief, beyond this world. And the women who helped them were often silenced, but not all were forgotten. Today, ethnobotanists are unearthing old spellbooks, folk records, and grave goods that reveal just how sophisticated some of these women were. They mapped plants the way modern scientists map molecules. They understood that too much nightshade kills, but a trace can calm hysteria. They knew that valerian opens the mind, that chamomile softens the fear, that wormwood sharpens the dream. And they passed it down, despite the fires, despite the prisons, despite the centuries of erasure. So the next time someone tells you herbal medicine is just superstition, remind them it survived plagues, inquisitions, and empires. Because healing, real healing, is a kind of rebellion. And rebellion, sometimes, smells like lavender and smoke. If the last chapter brought us into the haunted herb gardens and fire-lit kitchens of Europe's so-called witches, now we shift eastward to a world where intoxication wasn't criminal. It was divine exploration, where poetry, science, and altered states walked hand in hand under the moonlit domes of Baghdad, Cordoba, and Isfahan. We've arrived at the height of the Islamic Golden Age. And yes, people absolutely got high, but not just for pleasure, not just to forget. They got high to think, to expand, to write verses that pulsed like stars, to calculate the cosmos, to court the infinite. Let's set the scene. It's the 10th century. Baghdad is the beating heart of the Abbasid Caliphate. The streets smell of cardamom, dust, and fresh ink. The House of Wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah, is booming with scholars translating everything from Aristotle to Ayurvedic medicine. Algebra is being born. Optics is about to change forever. And yet, tucked between manuscripts and mathematics, is hashish. Let me be clear, not all Islamic scholars condoned intoxication. The Quran strictly forbids alcohol, and many legal schools extended that to all intoxicants. But just like in any society, law and practice don't always match. Hashish, derived from cannabis resin, was consumed widely across Persia, Mesopotamia, and North Africa. Some called it the herb of understanding, others the leaf of madness. It could be chewed, smoked, or infused into sweets, Majan being a popular choice. Think date paste, spices, nuts, and just enough hashish to make the universe shimmer. Who used it? Sufis. Yes, the mystical poets and whirling dervishes who sought union with the divine. For some Sufi orders, altered states were a legitimate path to transcendence. Not all relied on substances. Many used dance, breath, or music, but others incorporated mild doses of cannabis to help silence the ego, soften the veil, and slip into ecstatic clarity. One legend tells of a Sufi who, under the influence of hashish, looked into a mirror and whispered, "La ilaha illa Allah," there is no God but God, and then wept for 3 days, saying he finally saw the truth of his own insignificance. These weren't your average stoners. These were people using intoxication as theology, and they weren't alone. In Egypt, hashish was so widespread that the Mamluk Sultanate eventually issued bans, but even those were largely ineffective. Hashish cafes operated across Cairo, with pipe bearers, musicians, and poets all mingling in sweet-smoked shadows. In Andalusia, Islamic Spain, poets like Ibn Hazm and Ibn Quzman wrote verses dripping with perfume, longing, and altered perception. While direct mentions of hashish or wine were sometimes masked in metaphor, the meanings were clear to those who read between the lines. These cultures didn't always frame getting high as a failure of discipline. They sometimes saw it as a door. And that door swung both ways, because just as the mind could be lifted, it could also unravel. There are warnings in the texts of men who wandered into the desert naked, convinced they were prophets, of poets who saw angels made of fire, then spent the rest of their lives scribbling the same line over and over, of mystics who fasted, smoked, and sang themselves into madness. Altered states weren't toys, they were power, and power mishandled could fracture the soul, which is why the most respected Sufi teachers emphasized intention and discipline. They weren't drug dealers, they were guides, and they warned. Without humility, without purpose, the high becomes hollow. A trap, not a transcendence. Let's talk about Magin again, because this isn't just a medieval edible. It was a work of culinary pharmaceutical genius. Recipes varied, but many included dates for sweetness and energy, black pepper and cardamom to activate the herb and warm the body, saffron for mood and vivid dreams, cannabis resin for the lift, sometimes rosewater, sometimes ground almonds, always complex, always intentional. Taken in small amounts, Magin was said to sharpen the tongue, open the heart, and illuminate thought. Taken in excess, it could send you wandering for days, mentally or physically. We even have reports from physicians of the era documenting the effects: increased appetite, altered perception of time, laughter, paranoia, euphoria, heightened creativity or silence. In a way, these were the world's first stoner reviews, but written on parchment in calligraphy, under the flickering lamplight of medieval scholars. And here's the kicker. While Christian Europe burned women for brewing potions, Islamic physicians were writing medical treatises on how cannabis might help with digestion, melancholy, and insomnia. Different world, different judgment. Of course, not everyone celebrated this openness. By the 13th century, conservative theologians began pushing back hard. Hashish was banned outright in many regions. Punishments grew severe. Users were branded as idle, immoral, heretical. But bans didn't erase the memories. The poets kept writing. The gardens kept growing. The dervishes kept spinning. And somewhere in the back of a spice shop, someone was still grinding leaves into paste, whispering verses under their breath. Let's take one more turn into the secret corners of medieval Persia. Here, in the bustling bazaars and flower-filled courtyards of Shiraz and Isfahan, intoxication became an art form, not just in substance, but in language. Enter Hafez, Rumi, Omar Khayyam. These poets are still quoted today on coffee mugs, Instagram captions, tattoos. But few realize that many of their verses are coded in intoxication. Bring me the wine that takes reason away. This cup is filled with the sun. I was a drop until I drowned in the ocean of the beloved. These aren't just love poems. They're about ego death, about surrender, about a high that comes from unity, not escape. Did they drink actual wine? Some did. Some didn't. It almost doesn't matter, because what they were after was something far deeper than chemical pleasure. They wanted annihilation of the self. And whether that came through wine, hashish, dance, or prayer, it all led to the same place, God, or whatever name you give the infinite. So what do we make of all this? In the Islamic Golden Age, getting high wasn't always seen as a sin. Sometimes it was a sacrament, sometimes a science, and sometimes just a way to survive the unbearable weight of existence. But in every case, it was approached with reverence. They understood something we still wrestle with today. That altered states are powerful, not good, not bad, just powerful, and like all power, they demand respect. Last time we wandered through the gardens of Persia and the mystic halls of Sufi thought, where a spoonful of marjan or a puff of hashish could open the doors of the infinite. But now we turn west again, to a continent cloaked in cathedrals, cloisters, and candlelight. Welcome to medieval Christian Europe, where getting high looked very different. Or did it? Let's begin not in a tavern, but in a monastery. Imagine a Benedictine monk around the 12th century. The abbey bells echo at dawn. He rises before the sun, chants the divine office, copies scripture by hand. A life of discipline, devotion, and simplicity. But then he steps into the herbarium, a garden tucked behind the cloister. And there, he tends to mandrake, henbane, belladonna, not to get high but to heal, or so it seems. You see, these plants, later known as the witching herbs, weren't just folk remedies. They were kept in monastic pharmacies, logged in Latin by monks trained in both theology and materia medica. And their effects: hallucinogenic, dissociative, psychoactive. Used wrong, they could kill. Used just right, they could make you see angels. Here's the twist: medieval medicine wasn't separate from religion. Illness was often seen as a spiritual imbalance, caused by sin, demons, or divine trial. Healing then involved faith, ritual, and sometimes altered states. Take mandrake, for example. Its roots look eerily human. Limbs, torso, even a screaming mouth if you believe the myths. People said it shrieked when pulled from the ground. But monks used it to treat pain, insomnia, melancholy, and maybe more. In small doses, mandrake could cause vivid dreams, a sense of floating, even heavenly visions. Some patients claimed to see saints, others heard choirs. In effect, it was a medieval anesthetic and a doorway. But was it considered getting high? That's where things get murky. Because when the church sanctifies the ritual, the line between sacred and altered becomes invisible. And nowhere is this more true than in the Mass Let's Talk wine. In a time when clean water wasn't guaranteed, wine was a staple. But in the church, it became the blood of Christ. During Eucharist, bread and wine were believed, under the doctrine of transubstantiation, to become the literal body and blood of Jesus. For many devout believers, partaking in this ritual brought not just spiritual comfort but bodily sensations, tingling, tears, shivers. Some even reported ecstatic trances after communion. Was it the wine, the fasting, the belief? Probably all three. Faith, when intense enough, is its own intoxicant. And then there's the incense. Swirling clouds of frankincense and myrrh didn't just smell nice. They created an atmosphere thick with symbolism and sensory manipulation. In small chapels, where air was still and ceilings low, the smoke could build. Add fasting, candlelight, chanting, and you've created a full-blown sensory immersion, a trance without drugs. But not all Christian experiences were so official. Let's go underground, literally. To the anchorites, those holy recluses who walled themselves off in tiny cells to pray and meditate in solitude for life. Many of them fasted to the edge of death. They slept little, spoke less, and lived in total darkness. And in this deprivation, they reported visions of heaven, of demons, of God speaking directly into their hearts. What was happening? Modern scholars have suggested that these extreme ascetic practices triggered endogenous hallucinations. The body, deprived of food, light, and rest, begins to generate its own realities. Not unlike a psychedelic trip, but born entirely from within. Was it divine or biochemical? For medieval minds, the answer was both. But we can't talk about altered states in Christian Europe without bringing up mystic women. Because if there were medieval rock stars of visionary experience, it was women like Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich, and Margery Kemp. Hildegard, a 12th century abbess, claimed to receive visions from the age of 3. These weren't fleeting images. They were cosmic downloads. She described the living light of God entering her brain, triggering seizures of insight and prophetic clarity. Some of her visions read like acid trip poetry. Wheels of fire, celestial music, radiant beings of spinning color. She composed music, painted mandalas, wrote treatises on healing herbs, and yes, even prescribed psychoactive plants. And yet, she was never branded a witch, because she operated within the church. Julian of Norwich, during a near-death experience, entered a trance and received 16 showings from God. She emerged from the ordeal convinced of divine love and penned one of the first books in English written by a woman. Margery Kemp, she sobbed uncontrollably for hours in holy ecstasy, so much so that local priests tried to exorcise her. She refused to stop, claimed it was the Holy Spirit moving through her. Were these genuine spiritual encounters? Were they the result of malnutrition, trauma, or epilepsy? Or were they unintentional trips, born from the harsh realities of a life lived in devotion and constraint? Whatever the cause, their visions reshaped Christian thought and gave voice to women in a world that rarely listened. Let's not forget the darker side of all this. Because as belief in God's power intensified, so did fear of the devil's tricks. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Europe was gripped by witch-hunting hysteria. And what were witches accused of? Flying, shape-shifting, dancing naked with demons under the moon. And how did they do it? Flying ointments. These ointments, described in both trial records and folklore, were made from psychoactive herbs: belladonna, datura, henbane, mandrake. Applied to the skin, often on sensitive areas, they could induce full-blown hallucinations. Women claimed they rode broomsticks, that they turned into cats, that they consorted with spirits. Did they? Or were they simply tripping, accidentally or intentionally, on a potent blend of medieval chemistry? We'll never know. But some scholars believe these stories are distorted echoes of ancient rituals, pagan rites, goddess cults, herbal knowledge passed from mother to daughter, twisted into sin by a church that feared feminine power. The irony. The same plants demonized in witches, brews, were still being used, quietly, in monastic infirmaries. The same visions that condemned peasant women were celebrated when experienced by nuns. It wasn't the high that was feared. It was who got to have it. So what have we learned? That in medieval Christian Europe, altered states came in many forms: sacrament, wine and incense, medicine, herbal tinctures and roots, mysticism, fasting, darkness and prayer, condemnation, witchcraft and execution. Getting high wasn't about breaking rules. It was about who you were, why you did it, and whether the church approved. But the yearning, the hunger to go beyond the veil, that was the same in a cathedral or a hut, under a gold-painted dome or a moss-covered tree, because deep down the soul longs to expand. And sometimes expansion looks a lot like intoxication. So far, we've traveled from the smoke-filled temples of ancient Persia to the monastic herb gardens of medieval Europe. We've seen how saints, mystics, and even alleged witches all danced with altered states, whether they called it medicine, madness, or miracle. But now, we're crossing an ocean, because long before Europeans set sail, the peoples of ancient Mesoamerica and indigenous North America were already masters of the mind's sacred thresholds. And getting high, that wasn't sinful. That was ceremony. Let's begin in what is now southern Mexico. Here, among the humid forests and stone pyramids, the Maya, Aztec, Zapotec, and Olmec civilizations built empires not only of stone and mathematics, but of vision. And at the heart of it all, flesh of the gods. That's the name the Aztecs gave to psilocybin mushrooms, tiny, earthy fungi that grew after rainstorms, known today as magic mushrooms. But to them, they weren't magic. They were divine messengers. Consumed in ritual feasts and priestly ceremonies, these mushrooms were believed to let the user speak to deities, ancestors, and cosmic forces. Not recreational, not for escape. These experiences were intentional, orchestrated, and deeply spiritual. And the effects. The Spanish chroniclers, who were both horrified and fascinated, described participants laughing uncontrollably, weeping, or falling into trance. Some had visions of eagles, serpents, or celestial cities made of light. Others chanted or spoke in tongues. To the invaders, it looked like madness, but to the indigenous people, it was contact, a communion between the mortal and the eternal, and mushrooms weren't the only tools. In central Mexico, the Aztecs also revered aloliuqui, the seeds of a morning glory flower. Crushed and consumed in drink, these seeds induced dreamlike states and were used in healing, divination, and even legal trials. A kind of psychedelic truth serum, taken by priests to uncover guilt or find lost objects. Imagine that. Justice through altered perception. Even tobacco, today commercialized beyond recognition, had a radically different meaning. Among the Maya and other Mesoamerican peoples, tobacco wasn't a casual puff. It was a sacred smoke, used by shamans to purify, to protect, to carry prayers skyward. The act of smoking was ceremonial, deliberate, and often combined with rhythmic breathwork or chanting. But then, there was ayahuasca's northern cousin. In what is now the American Southwest, indigenous tribes like the Hopi, Navajo, and later, in Mexico and Texas, the Huical and Tarahumara, turned to a small, tough cactus growing in the desert. Peyote. This cactus, with its button-like top, contains mescaline, a powerful psychedelic compound. Consumed in spiritual gatherings, peyote took participants on long, slow journeys inward, visions of ancestors, spirit animals, and cosmic truths unfolding over hours. And here's the important thing. These weren't individual trips. They were collective rituals, often guided by elders or shamans, with songs, drums, and firelight anchoring the space. The peyote was part of a cycle, harvested respectfully, consumed with prayer, and always grounded in community purpose. It wasn't about escape. It was about return to truth, to spirit, to balance. Now let's talk about another ancient tool, the temazcal. Think of it as the indigenous sweat lodge, a dome-shaped structure built of stone or clay, heated by volcanic rocks. Water infused with herbs like sage or copal was poured onto the stones, creating thick, fragrant steam. Participants sat inside, sometimes for hours, fasting, chanting, breathing through waves of heat. And in that heat, they often reported visions. Some believe the altered states weren't just from the heat, but from the plants burned inside. Certain resins, like copal, release psychoactive compounds. Others say it was the oxygen deprivation or the deep meditative rhythm. Either way, the result was the same, an inner fire lit by ritual intensity. The temazcal wasn't just detox for the body, it was rebirth. Let's zoom in on the Huical of western Mexico. To this day, they undertake an annual pilgrimage to Wirikuta, a sacred desert, to harvest peyote. But before they even consume it, they walk for miles, barefoot, chanting, fasting. The journey itself is preparation, a purification, and when they finally reach the peyote fields, they ask permission from the spirit of the plant. Then they dance, they sing, they paint their bodies in vibrant colors. Their visionary art, created afterward, often depicts swirling patterns, jaguars, and deer, symbols seen during the trip. In this culture, getting high isn't indulgence, it's knowledge. It's connection to ancestors, to the earth, to the inner cosmos. But what did colonizers do when they saw this? They banned it. The Spanish, shocked by these pagan ceremonies, outlawed mushroom rites, peyote rituals, and sweat lodges. Indigenous shamans were labeled witches. Sacred plants were declared demonic. But the traditions survived, hidden in caves, passed through song, disguised as Catholic saints. Some rites were reborn inside churches, behind closed doors under other names. Because you can outlaw a plant, but you can't outlaw the hunger to see the divine. And the resistance didn't end in the 1500s. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, Native American tribes, especially those forced onto reservations, fought to preserve their spiritual practices. That's when the Native American church emerged. A fusion of Christianity and indigenous spirituality. This church used peyote as sacrament, like wine in Catholic Mass. Services were held in tipi circles, with sacred fire, drumming, and storytelling. The experience could last all night, with members emerging at dawn transformed. Despite persecution, arrests, and moral panic, the practice endured. In 1994, the U.S. government officially recognized peyote use as a protected religious right for members of the Native American Church. It was a hard-won victory, one that proved, for some cultures, altered states are sacred ground. So let's take a breath. What have we learned? That in the Americas, long before modern psychedelics were discovered by the West, there was already a deep, ancient science of the soul, one rooted in ritual, relationship, and respect. Mushrooms weren't drugs. They were gods in disguise. Smoke wasn't for escape. It was a ladder to the stars. Cactus buttons weren't chemicals. They were teachers. And getting high, it wasn't breaking the rules. It was following them. The rules written by the wind, the river, the drumbeat of creation. So far, we've explored the mystical brews of medieval witches, the forbidden ecstasies of monastic visions, and the sacred hallucinations hidden in Islamic poetry. But to truly understand the legacy of ancient highs, the kind that stretched the soul and rewired the senses, we have to look beyond Europe. Because long before the West ever debated the morality of a mushroom, entire civilizations were already experimenting with the divine chemistry of the natural world. And some of the most powerful traditions came from Africa. Let's begin in West Africa, where the cola nut wasn't just a snack, it was a ceremony. You've probably heard of cola because it gave the cola in Coca-Cola its name. But in its original context, the cola nut was deeply spiritual. Chewed for its stimulant properties, it was used in everything from tribal diplomacy to sacred rituals. Packed with caffeine and theobromine, cola didn't create hallucinations. It created alertness, clarity, energy. The kind of boost that sharpened your senses for prayer, music, or long conversation. Elders would offer cola before major decisions. Diviners would chew it before entering trance states. And during ceremonies, cola was passed around like a sacred offering, a symbol of unity, truth, and respect. But cola was just one part of the broader African pharmacopoeia. Let's go deeper. In Ethiopia, frankincense and myrrh weren't just exotic exports, they were instruments of ascension. These aromatic resins, when burned, filled temples with thick, intoxicating smoke. And it wasn't just about the smell, it was about the effect. These resins contain compounds that, when inhaled in concentrated doses, may impact the limbic system, that deep part of the brain tied to memory and emotion. Priests believed the smoke carried prayers upward. But more than that, it opened a gateway, a space between the visible and invisible, between the world of the living and the world of spirit. Sound familiar? Yeah, just like the flying ointments in Europe or the sacred cannabis of the Sufis. This was about transcendence through chemistry. And now, let's talk about iboga. This root, native to Gabon and parts of Central Africa, is one of the most powerful naturally occurring psychedelics in the world. Used by the Biwiti people, iboga is consumed during intense initiation ceremonies. Not casually, not for fun. This is soul work. The rituals are often supervised by elders and spiritual leaders. Participants ingest the bitter root and enter a prolonged altered state, sometimes lasting 24 to 36 hours. During this time, they report visions of ancestors, encounters with spirits, and deep insights into their personal and communal path. In modern times, iboga has even drawn attention for its use in addiction recovery. But for the Biwiti, it was always more than a cure. It was a teacher, a plant that reveals, not just heals. And then there's Egypt. Now, you might not immediately associate ancient Egypt with getting high, but evidence suggests otherwise. Texts from the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents in the world, mention plants like blue lotus, Nymphea caerulea, a flower that was steeped in wine and consumed for its psychoactive properties. Imagine sipping a wine infused with a flower that relaxes your body and gives you a warm, floating euphoria. That's the blue lotus. It wasn't about hallucinations. It was about pleasure, connection, divine seduction. No wonder the flower appears in so much Egyptian art, offered to gods, held by queens, blooming beside lovers. It was a symbol of rebirth, yes, but also ecstasy. And when the high priests conducted their rites, blue lotus was there. In chalices, in garlands, in the air. Let's shift continents, because in the Americas, the sacred highs were even more vivid. In Mesoamerica, cultures like the Aztecs, Maya, and Olmec worked with substances that profoundly altered consciousness. Psilocybin mushrooms, yes, magic mushrooms, were called Tiananacatl, or flesh of the gods. Used in religious ceremonies, these mushrooms weren't about escape. They were about encounter. The people who took them believed they were speaking with deities, entering the underworld or seeing cosmic truths. Likewise, the seeds of the morning glory vine, rich in LSA, a compound similar to LSD, were crushed and consumed in sacred rites. And then there's cacao. Yes, chocolate. The Mayans and Aztecs didn't eat it the way we do. They drank it bitter, foamy, spiced, and often mixed with substances like chili or even hallucinogenic flowers. It was a drink for warriors, for lovers, for the gods. In the Americas, intoxication wasn't recreational. It was revelatory. Back to Africa, because there's one more stop you need to make. In parts of North Africa, especially among Berber and Tuareg communities, hashish played a sacred role. And though its use was often frowned upon by Islamic orthodoxy, among Sufi mystics, it was a tool of love for the divine. Think about this. In a world of hardship, of nomadic travel, of war, of heat, these mystics found a plant that could melt the boundary between the self and the sacred. And in their poetry, they described these highs as intoxicating only to the soul. Because in Sufism, the real journey was always inward. But the question now is, why does this matter? Why should we care about ancient highs? About how people got stoned, drunk, or ecstatic 1,000 years ago? Because these stories tell us something essential. Human beings have always craved transcendence. Not just to numb pain, but to reach beyond. To touch the divine, to face death, to feel alive. From the herbal grannies of Europe stirring flying ointments in a cold forest hut, to the bee-weedy youth, trembling beside a fire with iboga in their veins, to the Maya priest, sipping bitter cacao under a blood moon. They all asked the same question. What's on the other side of this reality? And how do I get there? Last time, we uncovered how ancient empires bent the human desire to get high into a tool for control or resistance. But what if I told you that some of history's most powerful, mind-altering experiences didn't come from temples or emperors, but from cramped kitchens, dusty herb gardens, and candlelit monasteries? Because in the shadows of medieval castles, while lords and ladies plotted politics and power, a quieter revolution was brewing, literally. Welcome to the strange and potent world of medieval medicine. A time when healing, hallucination, and herbal mysticism walked hand in hand. Let's step into the apothecary's den. Imagine the scent of dried lavender, rosemary, and sage swirling with the sharp bite of vinegar and crushed wormwood. Jars line the shelves, some filled with roots, others with powders, oils, even mummified frog parts. And in the center of it all stood the medieval healer, part doctor, part magician, part alchemist. But make no mistake, they were pharmacists of their day, and many of their recipes were psychoactive. Let's start with one of the most notorious, mandrake. Yes, the plant that screams when you pull it from the ground, at least according to legend. In truth, mandrake is a real root, shaped like a human body, and packed with powerful alkaloids, hyoscyamin and scopolamine, which can induce hallucinations, sedation, and even delirium. It was used in surgical sedation, especially before amputations. A patient would be given a mandrake wine or sleeping sponge, fall into a trance, and wake up, hopefully alive. But here's the twist. People didn't just use it to numb pain. Some used it to see visions. Medieval mystics recorded mandrake-induced trances where they claimed to speak with angels or demons. And mandrake was just the beginning. Next, meet henbane, a favorite of witches and war doctors alike. Henbane was used to treat toothaches, tremors, and even asthma, but in large doses, it caused wild hallucinations and sensations of flight. That's right, flight. Many scholars believe the infamous flying ointments used by medieval witches were made from henbane, belladonna, and other nightshade relatives. These salves were rubbed onto the skin, or more discreetly, mucous membranes, to induce a dreamlike high where the user imagined soaring through the sky. Inquisitors thought it was witchcraft, but the truth, it was neurochemistry. It didn't matter whether you were a nun seeking divine ecstasy or a rebel woman running a back alley herb stand. If you knew the plants, you could touch the divine or the deranged. Meanwhile, in the monasteries of Europe, a quieter kind of experimentation was underway. Monks were among the most educated men of their time, and that included knowledge of herbal medicine. They cultivated physic gardens and transcribed ancient Greek, Roman, and Islamic texts that described hundreds of remedies. Some of those remedies, surprisingly psychedelic. Take wormwood, used in stomach tonics and later in absinthe. Or St. John's wort, long associated with banishing evil spirits, but also used as a mood stabilizer. And then there was ergot, a fungus that grew on rye. Consumed unknowingly in spoiled bread, ergot could cause convulsions, visions, and a sense of floating, a condition known as St. Anthony's fire. Entire towns would be afflicted, with people dancing uncontrollably in the streets or stripping off clothes, screaming that their limbs were burning. It sounds like madness, but behind the chaos was LSD's chemical ancestor. That's right, ergot is the natural origin of lysergic acid diethylamide. So yes, in medieval Europe, people were getting high on bad bread. Let's step away from Europe for a moment, because medieval medicine thrived across the Islamic world too. While Christian Europe sometimes burned women for mixing herbs, the Islamic Golden Age preserved, translated, and expanded ancient knowledge. In cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, scholars developed pharmacology as a science. They cataloged hundreds of substances, including hashish. Unlike the paranoia surrounding cannabis in Christian texts, Islamic medicine explored its uses openly. Hashish was used to relieve pain, improve mood, and treat digestive issues. It wasn't always praised. Many scholars warned against overuse, but it was understood, not demonized. Some Sufi mystics even used cannabis and other herbs to achieve altered states of consciousness. To them, intoxication was not escapism. It was a path to God. Their poems are filled with metaphors of wine, gardens, smoke, and love, not because they wanted pleasure, but because they wanted transcendence. It's a theme we see over and over again. When the body is hurting, the soul looks for escape, and sometimes that escape opens the door to revelation. And let's not forget the battlefield. Medieval warfare was brutal: swords, arrows, catapults, boiling oil. If you were wounded, you were lucky to survive. But if you did, you'd want a good surgeon and even better anesthetics. Before modern morphine, battlefield medics used opium-laced wine, cannabis extracts, and concoctions with datura to dull the agony. These weren't always reliable, but they were better than nothing. A soldier with a gaping wound might be given a draft so strong he'd forget his name. But in those moments, between pain and oblivion, some said they saw visions. Dead comrades, angels, fire, peace, pain and trance blurred. The battlefield became a liminal space, part life, part death, part dream. Even in domestic life, women were often the guardians of psychoactive knowledge. Granny's tea for childbirth pain could contain poppy syrup. A midwife's compress for anxiety, maybe lavender, but maybe also valerian, which works on GABA receptors like modern sedatives. And in the quiet corner of the hearth, a young girl might be taught to choose certain leaves not because they taste good, but because they help her see dreams. We like to think of the Middle Ages as rigid and repressed, but under the surface there were entire worlds of color, sensation, and inner journeys. The high was real, and it was sacred. So the question remains, were these medieval minds escaping pain or exploring it? Were they numbing themselves or waking up to hidden truths? Because in a time of constant death, disease, and divine fear, maybe getting high wasn't about forgetting the world, but about remembering a different one just beyond the veil. Hey guys, if you've made it this far, take a deep breath. Seriously, in through the nose, out through the mouth. Because right now you're not just watching a video, you're finishing a journey. One that began in smoky medieval kitchens, passed through royal courts and tribal fires, wandered into monastic cellars and secret temples, and now ends in a whisper of breath. You see, after all the powders, potions, and prayers, after all the forbidden herbs and ecstatic dances, what remained, what always remained, was something more ancient than any drug, more powerful than any sword: your breath. Across cultures, across time, the breath was sacred. In Sanskrit, prana; in Hebrew, ruach; in Greek, pneuma; in Latin, spiritus. Breath was life. And in the medieval world, where war, famine, and plague took so much, the ability to just breathe with intention became a form of quiet rebellion. A high no ruler could ban, no church could own. Think of the monks in silent contemplation, inhaling incense and chanting into the stone. Think of the Sufi dervishes, spinning through the veil of this world and into another. Think of the yogis, pulse slowing, spine rising, unlocking something wordless inside them. They weren't chasing pleasure, they were chasing presence. Because sometimes the most powerful high isn't escape, it's return. Return to self, to stillness, to spirit. We've talked about so much in this series. Psychedelic wines in Persian courts, Viking berserkers howling through battle fog, Aztec dancers moving in trances, Christian mystics shaking in visions, hair that told secrets, perfumes that stirred souls, and warriors, yes, women warriors, who wore their beauty like armor. But tonight, here's what I hope you remember most. They weren't just getting high, they were seeking meaning. And that's what we still do, isn't it? Whether it's through music, meditation, a midnight walk, or a deep conversation, we're trying to feel something real, something beyond the noise, something holy. You don't need incense or sacred herbs for that. Sometimes you just need to slow down, close your eyes, and let the world fall away. So thank you for walking this strange, beautiful, sometimes uncomfortable road with me, for being curious, for listening, for letting the past whisper its secrets into your modern life. And now it's time to let it all go, to lie back, to feel the rhythm of your chest rise and fall, and maybe, just maybe, to dream with a little more wonder than before. Because the truth is, you don't need to chase the stars. You already carry the cosmos inside you. Good night, my friend. Sleep deep, sleep brave, and may your dreams take you somewhere ancient, wild, and free.